Hey there, welcome to Shadow Archives. Just a heads up, there are a few ads between the 5 and 15-minute mark, then it's completely ad-free after that. I know many of you listen to these stories to relax or drift off to sleep. I hope you'll give this video a chance because I truly believe you won't find stories quite like these anywhere else. Before we begin, feel free to leave a comment and tell me where you're listening from tonight. And if you enjoy these stories, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. Now get comfortable, take a deep breath, and let's begin. One summer in the mid-'80s, I was 18 and working as the front of office admin for the largest department store in our mid-sized southern town. At that age, I already felt like I was juggling more responsibility than I knew what to do with. The front office was busy, loud, and stressful. Phones rang constantly, customers were impatient, managers needed things immediately, and I was expected to keep everything moving smoothly. I saw hundreds of people every single day, faces blurred together. Most of the time I went home exhausted, my head still buzzing with voices and problems that weren't mine anymore the second I clocked out. One night, long after the store had closed, I got a very late call at home. That alone was unusual. It was from one of the store managers, and his tone immediately told me something was wrong. He asked me if I had given a job application to a young woman earlier that day. He described her to me as best he could. I listened carefully, trying to picture her face, her clothes, anything at all that might stand out. I didn't remember her. I told him honestly that her description didn't ring any bells. That answer didn't sit well with either of us. He explained that her parents had filed a missing persons report. She was supposed to have been coming to our store while she was out running errands that day, and when she never came home, they started retracing her steps. Somewhere along the way, our store became one of the last known places she might have gone. That's when the weight of the situation really hit me. At the time, we had a system for job applications. I logged them when they were returned, not when they were handed out. People took applications all the time and never brought them back, so there was no practical way to track every single one that left the front desk. It wasn't negligence, it was just how things worked back then. This was long before security cameras were everywhere. Our store had cameras in a few key places, like the finance office and over the cash registers. There were some at the doors and scattered around the store, but nothing like what you'd see today. Security spent hours with the police going through what footage we did have. Tape after tape was reviewed. Angles were checked. Timestamps were replayed. In the end, there was no clear record of her ever coming into the store. No shot of her walking through the doors. No moment caught on camera that anyone could point to and say, "That's her." And then there was me. I was the human variable, the person who might have seen her face to face, the person who might have handed her an application, the person everyone kept asking about. I tried so hard to remember her. I replayed that day in my head over and over again. I thought about where I had been sitting, who I had spoken to, what time of day she might have come in. But nothing came. She didn't stand out in my memory at all. I couldn't honestly say yes or no. I simply didn't remember her. That answer followed me everywhere. Posters went up all over town. Her face was suddenly everywhere. On bulletin boards, in shop windows, on telephone poles. Her name was on the news constantly. Radio updates, TV segments. Everyone was talking about her, and because of my job, people knew I might have been one of the last people to see her. Strangers would ask me why I couldn't remember her. Some were kind about it, some weren't. Some looked at me like I was hiding something. Others looked at me with a mix of pity and frustration, like if I had just tried harder, maybe things would be different. I started questioning myself in ways that weren't healthy. I wondered if I had been distracted, if I had been careless, if I had failed her somehow without even realizing it. Weeks went by. then months, and then she was found. The truth was worse than anything people had imagined. A man had grabbed her from our parking lot, not from some dark alley or abandoned place, but from a normal, everyday parking lot that people used constantly. He took her far outside the city to a piece of deserted pasture and locked her inside a storage shed. The shed had no electricity, no plumbing, no comfort of any kind. She spent all that time in complete isolation, seeing only him when he came to bring her food. While she was trapped there, he went on with his life. That part still makes my skin crawl. He raised no suspicions. He lived his routine. He interacted with people who had no idea what he had done. Meanwhile, she was known by name and face across the entire town, the subject of constant worry and fear, while he blended in like nothing was wrong. When the news broke that she had been found alive, there was relief. But it was tangled up with horror. Everyone wanted details. Everyone wanted to know what had happened to her, where she had been, how she survived. After some time, she moved away to live with family in another state. She couldn't stay, not with everyone knowing who she was and what she had been through. In a town that size, there was no escaping the looks, the whispers, the questions. Even now, I don't remember all the details clearly. I don't remember if her car was found in our lot, or if he took it when he grabbed her. I don't remember if we ever learned whether she made it inside the store or if he took her before she reached the doors. I don't remember if the news ever officially said she was sexually assaulted, though I know most of us assumed she was. I don't remember if she escaped on her own or if she was discovered in the shed. I want to say she was found, but I don't remember by whom. I don't remember if he was caught or if he went to jail. I think I blocked a lot of it out. It was terrifying, and underneath the fear was guilt. Guilt that I couldn't give the police anything useful. Guilt that I might have been one small link in a chain that could have changed something if it had been stronger. Even though I knew logically that I wasn't responsible, the feeling didn't go away easily. What I do remember clearly is how much that kidnapping changed people. Every woman I knew altered her routines afterward. We stopped walking alone at night. We parked closer to entrances. We looked over our shoulders more. We memorized license plates. We checked in with each other constantly. The sense of safety we had taken for granted was gone, replaced by a quiet awareness that danger didn't always announce itself. For me, it was the moment I truly understood how fragile normal life is, how a regular day, a routine errand, a stop at a familiar store can turn into something unimaginable, and how sometimes, even when you're right there, even when you want to help, you're left with nothing but unanswered questions and the knowledge that things could have gone very differently. That story never left me. Even now, decades later, I still think about her and about that phone call and about the face I couldn't remember, and I still wish in some small, irrational part of my mind that I had been able to give a different answer. When my sister was 5 years old, she was sleeping the way only little kids can sleep, completely peaceful, unaware of the world beyond the edge of the bed. The house was quiet. Our parents were home. Everything was normal in the way childhood feels normal, safe, predictable. Nothing about that night suggested that it would become one of those memories our family would never be able to shake. She woke up because she heard someone whispering. At first, she didn't understand what she was hearing. When you're that young, sleep and waking blur together. Sounds don't always make sense right away, but the whisper kept going, close enough that it felt like it was meant for her. Soft, low, steady, not loud, not angry, just persistent. When she opened her eyes, she saw a man sitting right next to her bed. He wasn't standing in the doorway. He wasn't across the room. He was right there, close enough that she could see him clearly in the dim light. close enough that his presence filled the space around her. He leaned in slightly and kept whispering the same words over and over. "Come with me." Again and again. At first, my sister thought maybe it was our dad or some adult she knew. When you're 5, your brain tries to make sense of fear by fitting it into something familiar. But as she looked at him, she realized something was wrong. She didn't recognize him. He wasn't anyone she knew. His face didn't belong in our house. The moment that realization hit her, everything changed. The man stopped whispering. He moved fast. He didn't hesitate or try to calm her. He didn't say anything else. He stood up and ran. Not walked, not backed away. He sprinted out of her room, down the hallway, and straight toward the stairs. My dad was coming up at that exact moment, and the man blew past him, running downstairs, throwing the door open, jumping the fence outside, and disappearing into the dark. It happened in seconds. My dad chased him, but he was already gone. There was no clear evidence, no broken window, no forced door, no fingerprints, no witnesses outside the family. The police were never able to investigate properly because there was nothing to prove he had been there at all. It became one of those stories that sits in a strange space between reality and disbelief, especially to outsiders. But my sister knew what she saw, and our family knew something terrible had almost happened. That alone would have been enough to haunt someone for a lifetime. But for my sister, it wasn't the only time something like this happened. Years later, when she was 12, she went to stay the night at a friend's house. Their parents had gone out for the evening. This was before cell phones were common, especially in families like ours. We didn't have one. Neither did her friend. The house had a landline, but it had been having problems for weeks. Calls wouldn't go through reliably. Sometimes there was no dial tone at all. They were alone. At first, everything was fine. They were doing normal sleepover things, talking, laughing, watching TV, feeling grown up because they had the house to themselves for a bit. The parents had only been gone about 15 minutes when they heard a knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just a normal knock. Her friend froze immediately. She knew it was too early for her parents to be home. They had said they'd be gone longer. No one else was expected. They didn't answer it. They stayed quiet and waited. 3 minutes passed. Another knock. This time, it was firmer. They still didn't move. 2 minutes later, another knock. Then again, then again. The time between knocks got shorter and shorter. 2 minutes, 1 minute, 30 seconds, then almost non-stop. The knocking didn't sound frantic. It sounded deliberate, controlled, like whoever was on the other side knew exactly what they were doing. It went on for about 10 minutes. 10 minutes of pounding silence inside the house, interrupted only by the sound of knuckles hitting wood. My sister said it felt like hours. Their bodies were rigid. They barely breathed. They didn't speak to each other. They just listened. And then it stopped. Complete silence. No footsteps walking away, no sound of a car, just nothing. That silence was worse than the knocking. Eventually, my sister gathered the courage to move. Her heart was pounding so hard, she could feel it in her throat. She walked slowly toward the window next to the front door and pulled the curtain back just enough to see outside. All she could see was a pair of bloodshot eyes. They were halfway down the driveway, not right at the door, not far away, just standing there, staring straight at her. The screaming started instantly. My sister screamed. Her friend screamed. It was pure terror, the kind that rips out of you before you even think. The man screamed too, but his scream was different. It wasn't fear, it wasn't surprise. It was raw, unfiltered insanity. He screamed like something had snapped inside him, loud, broken animal. He screamed and started pounding on the door again, harder this time, violent, desperate, unhinged. And then something strange happened. My sister and her friend stopped screaming, not because they were calm, because something in them shut down. They stood there, frozen, listening to this stranger scream and pound and rage outside, knowing they had no way to call for help, no adults nearby, no safe plan. They were just kids trapped in a house that suddenly didn't feel like protection anymore. Then they heard the door open. At that moment, they were sure they were done. They didn't scream. They didn't wait. They ran. They bolted deeper into the house, their bodies moving on pure instinct, expecting hands to grab them at any second. But then they heard voices, familiar ones, panicked, confused. It was her friend's parents. They had just gotten home. The screaming stopped. The pounding stopped. The man was gone. Again, no proof. No one saw him clearly enough. No damage to the house, no witnesses, no physical evidence. And because my sister and her friend were kids, their fear was dismissed as imagination. Overactive minds, coincidence, stories that grew in the retelling. But my sister knew. She had seen that look before, that wrongness, that sense of being targeted, not randomly frightened. Twice in her life, at two very different ages, strangers had come to her while she was vulnerable, while she was sleeping, while she was alone, and both times they disappeared just before someone else arrived. Those kinds of experiences don't fade. They don't become funny stories or exaggerated childhood memories. They shape how you move through the world. How you lock doors, how you listen to footsteps, how you interpret silence. What makes this especially unsettling is not just the events themselves, but how little anyone did afterward. No investigation, no follow-up, no validation. Being told it was nothing, that it was imagination, that kids misinterpret things. That kind of dismissal can be almost as damaging as the fear itself. Because when something truly terrifying happens and the adults around you tell you it didn't, you learn something dangerous. You learn that your instincts can't be trusted, that your fear isn't valid, that even when something feels profoundly wrong, you might be on your own. My sister grew up carrying that. She doesn't talk about it often, but when she does, you can tell it's still there. The tension, the unease, the awareness that safety can vanish instantly, without warning, without explanation, that monsters don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they whisper, sometimes they knock politely, sometimes they wait, and sometimes they leave without a trace. What scares me the most isn't that these things were never solved. It's that whoever those people were, they were real. They existed. They walked into homes. They stood next to beds. They watched children through windows. And they were never stopped. No proof doesn't mean no danger. It just means no closure. Those nights changed how our family thought about safety. Doors were locked more carefully. Windows were checked. Lights were left on. And even then, there was always a sense that safety was something fragile, something you could never fully guarantee. My sister survived both encounters. Nothing happened in the way people usually define it. But something did happen. Something fundamental shifted. Fear doesn't always need an ending to stay alive. Sometimes the fact that it never gets one is exactly what makes it linger. This is something that happened to me and a close friend when we were still in school, and even now, years later, it's hard to think about without feeling a knot in my stomach. At the time, we didn't have the language or confidence to explain how serious it felt. We were kids, and adults didn't listen. Looking back as an adult, what scares me the most isn't just what was said, but how completely it was ignored. We had this one teacher that my friend and I absolutely hated. Not in the normal, homework is annoying kind of way, but in a deeper, more personal way. My older brother had her a few years before I did, and from everything he told me, She was petty, vindictive, and held grudges. By the time I ended up in her class, it already felt like she had made up her mind about me. I don't know exactly what my brother did to get on her bad side, but whatever it was, it followed me. From the beginning of the year, it was obvious she didn't like me. She singled me out, talked down to me, and seemed to assume the worst about anything I did. My friend was treated the same way once we started hanging out more. It felt like guilt by association. We tried to keep our heads down, do our work, and just get through the class, but nothing ever seemed good enough for her. Then Christmas break came. We were off school for a couple of weeks, and honestly, it was a relief. Being away from that class felt like being able to breathe again. When break ended and we came back to school, everything seemed normal at first. Same hallways, same noise, same routine, until we went to our lockers. Neither of us could open them. At first, we thought we were just messing up the combinations. It happens sometimes. You forget a number or turn the dial the wrong way. But after trying over and over, it became clear something was wrong. Both of our combinations had been changed. Not just one of us, both. That's when the dread set in. We immediately knew who was behind it. There was no official notice, no warning, no explanation beforehand. We hadn't been called into the office. No one had talked to us before break. It was just done, quietly, behind our backs. And the only person who had both the authority and the motive was that teacher. We went to her and asked what was going on. She told us, very casually, that our locker privileges had been taken away as punishment. When we asked why, she said that another student had reported us for bullying him, a kid we barely knew. A kid we had never talked to, a kid we had never interacted with in any meaningful way. We were stunned. We tried to explain that we didn't even know this kid, that we had never bullied anyone, let alone him. She didn't care. She said the accusation was enough. That was it. No investigation, no chance to defend ourselves, no details, just punishment. It felt humiliating. Lockers aren't just storage. They're part of how school works. Suddenly, we had to carry everything with us all day. Books, notebooks, supplies, coats. Everyone noticed. People asked questions. We didn't even know what to say. What made it worse was the injustice of it. Being punished for something we didn't do, based on the word of someone we'd never even spoken to, and knowing deep down that the teacher was probably enjoying it. Out of frustration and confusion, we decided to talk to the kid himself. We didn't confront him aggressively. We just wanted to know if he had actually said we were bullying him, or if this was some kind of misunderstanding. That conversation is burned into my memory. When we asked him, he didn't look confused or surprised. He didn't deny it. Instead, he looked at us in this way that still creeps me out when I think about it. He lowered his voice, and it was deep and flat and wrong, like he was trying to sound intimidating. And then he said something that made my blood run cold. He told us that when he shot up the school, we were going to be the first ones to die. Not if, when. There was no nervous laughter, no joking tone. He didn't smile. He just said it calmly, like he was talking about something inevitable, like it was already planned. For a second, neither of us even knew how to react. Our brains couldn't process what we had just heard. This wasn't trash talk. This wasn't a stupid insult. This was a direct threat of mass violence aimed specifically at us. We were terrified. As soon as we could, we went straight back to the teacher who had taken our lockers away. We told her exactly what he said, word for word. We expected her to be alarmed. We expected her to take it seriously. We expected her to do something. She didn't. She dismissed it immediately. She told us that he wasn't the type to do something like that we were probably exaggerating, that we misunderstood him. She acted annoyed, like we were wasting her time or trying to get out of trouble. We left her classroom feeling sick, so we went to the principal. Surely, we thought, this is where someone will listen. This is where adults will step in and protect students. We explained everything again. The locker punishment, the false bullying accusation, the threat. We told her how scared we were, and she said the same thing. She didn't believe us. She said the student didn't seem like someone who would do that. She said kids say stupid things sometimes. She said there was no reason to overreact. Nothing happened. No report, no investigation, no consequences, no safety plan, no reassurance, nothing. The kid continued going to school like normal. He continued making comments. He continued existing in the same hallways as us, knowing he had said something that should have triggered immediate action, and knowing that no one believed us. From that point on, school became a daily nightmare. Every morning we wondered if this was the day. Every loud noise made us jump. Every time there was an announcement over the intercom, our hearts raced. We watched him constantly, trying to read his behavior, trying to figure out if he was serious or just saying things for attention. But how are kids supposed to make that judgment? We were expected to just live with it, to focus on homework, to worry about grades, to act normal while carrying around the fear that someone had explicitly told us he planned to kill us. The adults around us failed completely. They didn't just fail to punish him, they failed to protect us. They failed to even acknowledge that what he said was dangerous. Instead, they made us feel dramatic, like we were the problem, like we were causing trouble by speaking up. That's a special kind of betrayal. We spent the rest of the school year in a constant state of anxiety. We avoided him as much as possible. We stuck together. We planned escape routes in our heads without even realizing that's what we were doing. We learned where exits were. We paid attention to things kids shouldn't have to think about. Luckily, nothing ever happened. He never acted on his threats. The year ended. We moved on to the next grade. Life continued. But luckily feels like the wrong word, because the fact that nothing happened doesn't mean the situation was handled correctly. It doesn't mean the adults were right to ignore it. It just means we survived something that could have gone very differently. What still messes with me is how easily it could have been prevented. All it would have taken was one adult taking us seriously, one report, one intervention, one moment of saying, "This is not okay." Instead, we were taught a horrible lesson. We were taught that authority figures don't always protect you, that speaking up doesn't guarantee help, that sometimes adults would rather avoid discomfort than deal with a real problem. That lesson sticks with you. Even now, when I hear about schools ignoring warning signs, dismissing threats, or brushing off student concerns, I think back to that year. I think about how young we were, how scared we were, how alone we felt. I also think about how many other kids might be in similar situations right now, being told they're exaggerating, being told that kid wouldn't do something like that, being forced to carry fear quietly because no one wants to deal with it. The scariest part of the whole thing isn't that a kid said something horrible. Kids can say awful things. The scariest part is that the system designed to keep us safe completely failed, and then acted like that failure was acceptable. We were lucky, but luck is not a safety plan, and no kid should ever have to spend an entire school year wondering if today is the day they die, just because the adults around them chose not to listen. This happened about a year ago, and even now, thinking about it, makes my stomach drop in a slow, uneasy way. Not because of anything dramatic I personally saw, but because of how ordinary it all felt at first, and how quickly that normalcy turned into something deeply disturbing. It started as just another morning. My husband was driving to work early before most people were fully awake. The roads were quiet in that familiar way where traffic exists but hasn't fully come alive yet. He was on a stretch of road where it's common to see wildlife, especially deer. Anyone who lives in an area like that knows the routine. You stay alert, you watch the shoulders, and sometimes you come across animals that didn't make it across in time. That morning he saw what looked like parts of a dead deer scattered across the road. It wasn't a full body, just pieces, enough that he had to slow down and swerve slightly to avoid what he could. Some of it was unavoidable. A few pieces rolled underneath the car as he passed. He felt the slight bump, heard the dull sound, and then it was over. Unpleasant but not shocking. Sadly, it's not uncommon. Roadkill happens. You acknowledge it, feel a brief wave of discomfort, and move on with your day. He didn't think much of it afterward. He went to work. The day passed like any other. Emails, tasks, conversations, the usual mental clutter that pushes smaller moments into the background. That morning drive became just another forgettable detail, filed away without any special significance. It wasn't until he drove home that everything changed. On his way back, he noticed something was different about that same stretch of road. Traffic was slowed. There were police vehicles pulled over. Yellow tape blocked off sections of the area. Officers were walking around carefully, placing markers on the ground, taking photos, documenting something with an intensity that immediately signaled this was not a routine situation. The road he had driven that morning without a second thought had become a crime scene. He slowed down, confused at first, trying to understand what could have happened. Accidents happen, sure, but this didn't look like the aftermath of a crash. There were no damaged vehicles, no skid marks leading into twisted metal, just police, tape, and a level of focus that suggested something far more serious. Later, we found out the truth. It hadn't been a deer. It had been a person. The remains on the road were human, dismembered, so badly mangled that at first glance, even experienced eyes couldn't immediately recognize them as belonging to a human being. That alone is horrifying to process. The idea that someone could look at what was left of a person and reasonably mistake it for an animal speaks to the level of violence involved. When my husband told me, I felt a strange mix of emotions all at once. Shock, obviously, horror, but also something quieter and harder to name. A creeping realization that he had unknowingly driven through the remains of another human being, that pieces of someone's body had rolled under his car, that this had happened without him realizing it at the time. That detail stuck with me more than anything else. The investigators eventually pieced together some information. The victim was identified as someone from Florida who had been traveling. Beyond that, details were scarce. The working theory was that whoever killed him had dismembered the body and then disposed of the remains by throwing them out of a moving vehicle during the middle of the night. The scattered nature of the remains supported that idea. It wasn't a single dump site. It was like someone had methodically, or perhaps carelessly, distributed pieces along the road. The idea of that alone is chilling. Someone driving through the darkness, windows open or closed, throwing parts of a human body out onto an empty road. No witnesses, no immediate confrontation, just a quiet act of extreme violence followed by silence. By morning, the road was back to being just a road again, with only fragments left behind to hint at what had happened hours earlier. As far as I know, they never figured out who did it. No suspect was publicly named. No clear motive emerged. No satisfying conclusion followed. It became one of those cases that people talk about in hushed tones, then slowly stop mentioning as time passes, even though the questions never really go away. That's part of what makes it so unsettling. If it had been solved, if there had been an arrest, a confession, a story that explained how and why this happened, maybe it would feel more contained. Maybe it would feel like a closed chapter. But unsolved violence has a way of lingering. It stays open-ended in your mind, like a door that was never properly shut. I kept thinking about the victim, a person from Florida traveling for reasons we may never fully know. Were they visiting family, moving somewhere new, on a road trip, on the way to start a job or meet someone important to them? At some point, they crossed paths with the wrong person, and their life ended in a way that stripped them of dignity, anonymity, and even physical wholeness. I also thought about their family. Somewhere, people got a phone call that changed their lives forever. A call that probably didn't include many answers, just the brutal fact that their loved one was dead, and that the circumstances were horrific and unclear. Knowing that someone you loved didn't just die but was dismembered and discarded like trash is a level of pain I can't fully comprehend. What really haunts me is the randomness of it all. My husband didn't do anything wrong that morning. He didn't take a risky route. He didn't stop to investigate something suspicious. He was just driving to work, doing what millions of people do every day. And he unknowingly passed through the aftermath of a murder. That could have been anyone. Anyone driving that road at that time could have seen the same thing, could have made the same assumption, could have gone about their day completely unaware of the truth. That realization makes the world feel less solid, less predictable. It also changed how I think about what we see and what we assume. We're wired to categorize quickly, to see something unpleasant and label it in the least disturbing way possible so we can move on. Roadkill instead of remains, accident instead of violence, animal instead of person. Sometimes that instinct protects us. Other times it hides something far darker, just beneath the surface. After that, I found myself paying closer attention when I drove. Not in a paranoid way, but in a more aware way. When I saw debris on the road, I didn't immediately dismiss it. When I passed areas taped off by police, I didn't assume it was something minor. I realized how much can happen while we're asleep. How much of the world's worst moments occur in silence, unnoticed until daylight forces them into view. My husband struggled with it too, even if he didn't talk about it much. He mentioned feeling unsettled when he thought back on that morning. The sound of something rolling under the car, the fact that he had physically interacted with the scene without knowing it. That's a strange kind of proximity to violence, not witnessing it, not being involved, but brushing up against it in a way that lingers in your body more than your mind. There's also a quiet fear that comes with knowing the killer was never found. It raises questions you don't really want to ask. Who were they? Were they local? Were they just passing through? Was it a crime of opportunity or something planned? Did they ever do something like that again? The lack of answers leaves room for your imagination to wander, and that's rarely a comforting place. I think about how easily it could have gone unnoticed entirely, if no one had reported it, if no one had driven that road later in the day, if rain had come and washed things away. How many acts of violence slip through the cracks simply because they don't present themselves clearly enough to be recognized right away? The idea that someone's body could be mistaken for an animal and driven over before anyone realized what it was feels deeply wrong, even though no one involved did anything intentionally cruel. It highlights how fragile human identity becomes after death, how quickly context can be lost. What stays with me the most is the contrast. Morning, a routine drive, a brief swerve, an unpleasant but familiar sight. Evening, police tape, investigators, markers on the ground. The weight of something truly awful settling into place. Nothing about the road itself changed. The asphalt was the same. The surroundings were the same. The distance between those two moments was just time and information. That's all it took to transform something ordinary into something horrific. I still think about that person from Florida sometimes. I don't know their name, I don't know their face, but I know their story ended in a way that shouldn't happen to anyone. I know that pieces of them were scattered on a road and mistaken for something else. I know that their killer may still be out there, unknown, unaccountable. And I know that my husband, completely unknowingly, passed through the aftermath of that violence and carried it home with him in a way neither of us expected. It's a reminder that the world doesn't separate normal life from true crime as cleanly as we like to believe. Sometimes they overlap. Sometimes they touch for just a moment. Sometimes you don't realize what you were close to until much later. That thought still makes me uneasy, not because I'm afraid it will happen again in the same way, but because it showed me how thin the line really is between an ordinary day and something that changes how you see the world forever. Before I was born, my mom was teaching at the local high school, and my dad was working as a contractor, and their lives were about as ordinary and predictable as you could imagine for a young family just starting out. They had recently moved into a new house in what they believed was a quiet, safe neighborhood. It wasn't flashy or particularly special, but it was theirs. They were building a future there. My older brother was still just a baby at the time, completely dependent on them, unaware of anything beyond being fed, held, and comforted. My parents' world revolved around work, home, and caring for him. My mom spent her days in classrooms, surrounded by teenagers. She graded papers, planned lessons, dealt with the usual challenges of teaching high school students. She knew their names, their personalities, their habits. Some were quiet, some disruptive, some struggling, some ambitious. Like many teachers, she carried the emotional weight of her job home with her, thinking about students who seemed troubled or who didn't quite fit in. My dad, meanwhile, worked with his hands. He was constantly on job sites, lifting heavy materials, using tools, fixing and building things. It was normal for him to come home with dirt under his nails, sore muscles, and small cuts or scratches on his hands and arms. That was just part of the job. Their neighborhood felt calm, the kind of place where people assumed nothing truly bad could happen. Neighbors waved, people recognized each other's cars, and there was a general sense of routine. No one locked themselves away in fear. My parents certainly didn't feel like they were living anywhere dangerous. They were focused on raising a baby, paying bills, and settling into married life. Then, just a few blocks away from their house, everything changed. One night, a family in the neighborhood was brutally murdered. From what my parents were told, it was a random break-in. There was no personal connection, no long-standing feud, no warning signs that anyone noticed beforehand. An intruder entered the home and killed a mother and, as my parents remember it, at least 2 children. The details were horrifying, the kind of crime that shakes an entire community to its core. It wasn't just tragic, it was incomprehensible. People couldn't understand how something like that could happen so close to home. The neighborhood was thrown into fear almost immediately. Police cars flooded the area. Officers went door to door, asking questions, trying to piece together timelines, looking for anything that might point them toward a suspect. Suddenly, the quiet streets felt watched. Every unfamiliar sound felt suspicious. People who had lived there for years started looking at each other differently, wondering who might know something, or worse, who might be capable of something like that. My parents were right in the middle of it. One day, as my dad was coming home from work, still wearing his work clothes, still tired from a long day, police officers stopped him in the driveway. They didn't ease into the conversation. They grabbed his attention immediately and started asking questions. They wanted to know where he had been on the day of the murders, what time he left work, what time he got home, who could vouch for him. Then they noticed his hands and arms. Like most contractors, my dad had cuts and scratches, small ones, nothing unusual, the kind you don't even think about after a while. To the police, though, those marks suddenly mattered. They asked him where every cut came from, how old they were, whether he could explain each one. In that moment, something as ordinary as doing your job became suspicious. My dad later told us how unsettling that was. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong, but being questioned like that, especially with a baby inside the house and his wife just a few steps away, was terrifying. He explained that he was a contractor. He talked about his work, his job sites, his tools. He gave them an alibi. Other people could confirm where he had been. After some time, the police were satisfied and let him go. But that didn't erase the fear. For my parents, that moment drove home just how close the violence was, not just physically, but emotionally. The police weren't stopping strangers miles away. They were stopping neighbors, people like them, people who lived normal lives and came home tired from work. It made everything feel fragile, like safety was something that could be taken away at any moment. Eventually, the investigation continued, and the truth came out. The killer was caught, and when my parents found out who it was, the shock was almost worse than the crime itself. The person responsible wasn't some unknown drifter or random outsider who had passed through town. It wasn't a faceless monster from somewhere else. It was someone local, someone who blended into daily life. It turned out to be one of my mom's students, a teenager she had taught, a student she had seen in class, maybe spoken to, maybe corrected, maybe encouraged. Someone who sat at a desk, turned in assignments, walked the same halls as hundreds of other kids every day. Someone who, on the surface, was just another student. That realization hit my parents hard. My mom had to grapple with the fact that someone she had been responsible for teaching, someone she had been around regularly, was capable of something so horrific. It forced her to rethink every interaction she'd ever had with him. Had there been signs? Had there been moments she dismissed or didn't fully understand? Teachers often wonder about the lives their students live outside of school, but this was something else entirely. For my dad, it reinforced how close he had come to being tangled even deeper in the situation. For a brief moment, he had been a suspect. If things had gone differently, if he hadn't had a solid alibi, if someone had misinterpreted something, his life could have been turned upside down. All while the real killer was someone already known to the family through my mom's work. As I grew up and heard this story, what terrified me most wasn't just the crime itself. It was the proximity of it all. The fact that my parents lived just blocks away. The fact that the police questioned my dad. The fact that the killer was someone my mom saw regularly in a classroom. It made the whole thing feel uncomfortably close, like the boundary between normal life and absolute horror was paper thin. I think about my older brother being a baby at the time, completely unaware of what was happening around him. I think about my parents trying to protect him while also dealing with fear, uncertainty, and the realization that their sense of safety had been an illusion. I think about how easily their lives could have been altered in ways they never imagined. Even though I wasn't alive yet, this story has always stayed with me. It shaped how I think about crime, about neighborhoods, about the idea that danger always comes from somewhere else. Sometimes it doesn't. Sometimes it's right there, woven into everyday life, hidden behind familiar faces and routines. What scares me the most is how ordinary everything was before it happened. A teacher going to work, a contractor coming home with cuts on his hands, a baby sleeping in a crib, and just a few blocks away, something unspeakable was unfolding. That closeness is what makes it terrifying. Not the distance from danger, but how easily it can exist alongside normal life without anyone realizing it until it's too late. when I was with my mother leaving a hospital, and even though the moment itself was brief, it left a deep impression on me. It's one of those memories that replays in your mind, not because a lot happened, but because what you saw didn't make sense in the moment, and your brain keeps trying to process it afterward. We were done with our visit and heading out through one of the hospital exits. It wasn't a glass door or anything you could see through. It was a solid metal door, the kind that gives you no warning about what's on the other side. You push it open and whatever is there is suddenly right in front of you. There's no time to prepare yourself. I remember feeling normal as we walked toward it. Hospitals always have that strange atmosphere, quiet but tense at the same time. The smell of disinfectant, the echo of footsteps, the low hum of machines somewhere in the background. You're usually already a little on edge in places like that, even if nothing bad has happened to you personally. My mother pushed the door open, and the moment it swung outward, we both froze. Right there, just on the other side of the door, was a woman standing completely still. She wasn't trying to come in. She wasn't walking away. She was just standing there, facing the hospital, staring straight ahead. Her posture was stiff, unnatural, like she had been placed there and forgotten. For a split second, my brain couldn't even register what I was seeing. It felt like time slowed down. Then I noticed the blood. Her head was covered in it. Blood had run down from her scalp, streaking her face and soaking into her clothes. It wasn't fresh and dripping, but it was enough to be unmistakable. Enough that there was no question something serious had happened to her. Her clothes looked like the kind someone would be wearing during a normal day, but now they were stained and disheveled, as if she had been in an accident. What made it even more disturbing was her expression. She didn't look panicked. She didn't look like she was crying or calling for help. She didn't look angry or even afraid. She looked blank, empty, like she was in shock and didn't fully understand where she was or why she was there. It was as if her body had brought her to the hospital on instinct, but her mind hadn't caught up yet. She didn't react to us opening the door. No flinch, no step back, no acknowledgement at all. That was the moment the fear hit me. A sharp, sudden jolt of it. I wasn't scared because she looked threatening. I was scared because she looked wrong, like someone who had just been through something terrible and was no longer fully present in the moment. For a brief second, I honestly didn't know what to do. My body reacted before my mind did. My heart jumped, and I felt that cold rush you get when you're startled badly. It was the kind of scare that leaves you shaky afterward, even if nothing else happens. My mother reacted faster than I did. She immediately focused on the woman, asking if she was okay, if she needed help. That seemed to break whatever spell the moment was under. The woman blinked slowly, like she was coming back to herself. But even then, her movements were sluggish and confused. Looking back, it really did seem like she had arrived at the hospital without fully knowing why. Like she had been injured, gone into shock, and somehow made it there on autopilot. The hospital, a place meant for help, was right in front of her, yet she stood outside it, unable to take the final step inside. That contrast is what stays with me the most. The place designed for emergencies, healing, and safety was right there, and she was just standing outside, bleeding, frozen in place. It made the whole scene feel surreal, almost unreal, like something from a dream or a movie, except it was happening right in front of us. Eventually, staff were alerted, and the situation was handled. The woman was taken inside and cared for. Nothing else dramatic happened after that. But the image of her standing there, covered in blood, staring at the hospital doors without entering, never really left me. Even now, when I think about it, I remember the shock more than anything else. The suddenness of it. One moment you're just leaving a building, thinking about going home, and the next, you're face to face with someone who looks like they've just stepped out of a nightmare. It reminded me how thin the line is between normal life and crisis, how quickly things can change, and how sometimes the most frightening moments aren't loud or violent, but quiet, still, and completely unexpected. That single second when the door opened was enough to leave a mark on me, a reminder that real life can be just as unsettling as any story, especially when you're not prepared for what's waiting on the other side of a door. Sorry to interrupt. If you're new here, I'd appreciate it if you subscribe to Shadow Archives for daily true horror content that will haunt your dreams and keep you wondering what lurks in the shadows. And don't forget to tap the notification bell so you never miss a new story when the darkness calls out to you. This isn't my story directly, but it's something that happened to someone I know, and it's one of those stories that gets under your skin the more you sit with it. I heard it years ago, and even now it still makes me uneasy, not because of anything dramatic or violent, but because of how subtle and wrong it all felt. I'll tell it the way it was told to me. We'll call the two guys Mark and Roger. They were both young, early 20s, the kind of age where you feel invincible and bored at the same time. They lived close enough to Freetown State Forest that it had become a sort of local legend for them. Everyone around there knew about the forest. Even if you'd never been, you'd heard stories. Stories about strange lights, disappearances, cult activity, rituals, people going missing, people coming back changed, or not coming back at all. It had a reputation that went back decades, and whether you believed in the supernatural or not, most people agreed on one thing: it was not a place you messed around in at night. Of course, that reputation was exactly what made it appealing to them. One night, Mark and Roger got drunk together. Not just a couple of beers, but properly drunk. The kind of drunk where ideas sound brilliant and consequences feel very far away. They were sitting around talking about dumb stuff, laughing, and at some point the conversation drifted to the forest. One of them joked about how people were scared of nothing. The other said something along the lines of, "We should go check it out." And instead of anyone being the responsible one and shutting the idea down, they both leaned into it. That's how bad decisions usually start. They decided to take a late-night trip into the forest. No real plan, no flashlight worth mentioning, no respect for the place they were going, just alcohol, bravado, and curiosity. They drove out there, parked near one of the access points, and stumbled their way inside. At first, it was exactly what you'd expect. Trees, dirt paths, darkness. The forest swallowed sound in that way forests do at night, where even your own footsteps feel too loud. The air was colder than they expected, and the smell of damp earth and leaves hung thick around them. Still, they laughed it off. They joked. They made fun of each other for jumping at shadows. Being drunk helped with that. Alcohol dulls fear. It makes you feel like you're in control, even when you're not. They walked deeper in, not following any real trail, just wandering. Time became fuzzy. They weren't sure how long they'd been in there. 10 minutes, half an hour, longer. It's hard to tell in the dark, especially when you're intoxicated. The forest started to feel bigger, more closed in, but neither of them wanted to be the first to admit they were uncomfortable. Then they heard it. From somewhere off in the darkness, a voice called out clearly, "Marco!" It wasn't loud. It wasn't shouted. It was spoken in a normal tone, like someone calling to a friend. The word echoed just slightly between the trees. Mark and Roger stopped walking. At first, neither of them reacted. Their drunk brains tried to process what they'd just heard. Someone else was out there. That was the obvious explanation. Another hiker. Another group of idiots doing the same thing they were doing. The forest was known, after all. People went there despite the warnings. But something about it felt off. They hadn't seen headlights. They hadn't heard footsteps. They hadn't heard any other voices, just that one word. Marco. Roger, in his drunken state, thought it was hilarious. Without thinking, without hesitation, he cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled back, "Polo!" The sound carried farther than he probably expected. It echoed through the trees, bouncing back in a way that suddenly made the forest feel much larger and much emptier at the same time. The moment after he yelled it, the mood shifted. Mark later said that it felt like the air itself changed, like the forest went quiet in a way it hadn't been before. No insects, no distant movement, just silence. The kind of silence that feels intentional, like something is listening. They waited. Nothing happened. No reply, no laughter, no footsteps approaching. After a few seconds, Roger laughed again, a little louder than necessary, trying to keep things light. Mark didn't laugh. He suddenly felt sober enough to realize how stupid that had been. They both agreed it was probably time to leave. Turning around in the forest at night is always worse than walking in. Everything looks unfamiliar. Trails disappear, trees all look the same. The confidence they'd had on the way in was gone now, replaced by a growing sense of unease. They weren't panicking, but they were definitely more focused, more alert. As they walked back toward where they thought the exit was, neither of them spoke much. The jokes stopped. Every snapped twig made them glance over their shoulders. Every shadow felt deeper. They were almost out. They could see the thinning of trees ahead, the suggestion of open space where the forest ended and the road began. Relief started to creep in. That's when they saw him. A figure stepped into view on the path ahead of them. He was walking slowly, deliberately from the side of the trail, crossing in front of them. He didn't rush. He didn't acknowledge them at first. He was wearing a dark hooded garment, something that obscured his face completely. Not a hoodie like you'd see on a normal person, but something longer, heavier, hanging in a way that didn't quite look modern. Mark and Roger slowed their pace instinctively. The figure stopped just a few feet away from them, close enough that they could tell he was facing them, even though they couldn't see his face. The hood cast deep shadows, hiding everything. They couldn't tell how old he was. They couldn't tell if he was smiling or staring or expressionless. Then he spoke. "Marco?" He said it calmly, casually, like he was continuing a game. Mark felt his stomach drop. In that instant, the drunken haze vanished completely. His mind raced back to the earlier voice in the woods. The timing, the repetition, the way it all lined up too neatly. Roger didn't respond this time. Neither of them did. They both pretended they hadn't heard anything at all. They kept walking, not running, not reacting, just moving past the figure like he wasn't there. Mark later said that every instinct in his body was screaming at him to run, but something told him that running would be the worst possible thing to do. As they passed, the figure didn't move. He didn't follow them. He didn't speak again. He just stood there, still and silent, as they walked by. They didn't look back. They didn't stop until they were out of the forest and back at their car. Only once the doors were locked and the engine was running did either of them speak. Roger's face had gone pale. He wasn't laughing anymore. He didn't make jokes. He just kept saying, "What the hell was that?" over and over again. They drove away without looking back. Later, when they sobered up and talked about it, the fear really set in. They started connecting dots they hadn't wanted to connect at the time. The forest's reputation, the stories of rituals and cults, the idea of call and response games being used to lure people deeper into the woods. The way the figure had known exactly what word to say. They couldn't prove anything. There was no crime, no evidence, just an experience that didn't sit right. Some people might say it was just another drunk messing with them. Someone who heard them yelling and decided to scare them. That explanation makes sense on the surface, but it doesn't explain how quiet the forest had been. It doesn't explain the timing. It doesn't explain the way the figure appeared right as they were leaving, as if he knew exactly where they would come out. And it doesn't explain why neither of them could shake the feeling that if Roger had answered Polo again, something very bad would have happened. The forest has a long history of people claiming strange encounters. Some say it's haunted, some say it's cursed. Some say it attracts the worst kinds of people. Others say it's all exaggeration, that fear feeds on itself and turns normal events into something sinister. But Mark and Roger never went back. They don't laugh about it now. They don't tell the story as a joke. When it comes up, their tone changes. They tell it plainly, without embellishment. And then they usually say the same thing. Don't play games in that forest. Whether it was something supernatural, something human, or something in between, they don't pretend to know. They just know that someone answered when they shouldn't have, and someone else was waiting to see if the game would continue. And that's what makes it unsettling. Not the idea of ghosts or demons, but the idea that something out there was listening, waiting for the right response, ready to keep playing if they had let it. I was 10 years old when this happened, and even now, years later, the memory feels uncomfortably clear, like it never settled into the past the way other childhood memories did. It didn't blur at the edges. It didn't soften with time. It just stayed exactly the way it was, sharp and vivid, waiting to surface whenever the room is quiet enough. We had just moved into a new house. Everything still felt unfamiliar in that way new places do when you're a kid. The walls didn't feel like yours yet. The floors made different sounds than you expected. At night, every little creak felt louder than it should have. My bedroom was upstairs, and my bed was positioned so that the head of it sat directly beneath the window. If I leaned back far enough, I could almost feel the glass above my head. I've always slept with my window open when I can. Even as a kid, I liked the feeling of night air moving through the room. It made me feel calmer somehow, like the house was breathing with me. That night, the window was open the same way it always was. Nothing about it felt risky or strange at the time. It was just how I slept. I remember lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, unable to fall asleep. I've had mild insomnia for as long as I can remember, so that part wasn't unusual. My mind wandered. I shifted around. I listened to the distant sounds outside, trying to let them fade into background noise. Eventually, sometime around 12:30, I started to drift. Not fully asleep, not fully awake. That strange in-between state where your body relaxes but your awareness hasn't shut off yet. That's when I heard it. A whisper. It was close, too close, not across the room. Not outside in the distance, right there, near my head. At first, I thought maybe I was dreaming. My brain tried to dismiss it immediately, the way it always does when something doesn't make sense. But then I heard the words clearly. Come with me. Before I could even process what I'd heard, something grabbed my hair. I had long, thick hair at the time, and it was yanked upward with enough force that my head lifted off the pillow. The sensation was so sudden and violent that it knocked every thought out of my mind. There was no build-up, no warning. 1 second I was half asleep in my bed, and the next my head was being pulled toward the open window above me. Panic hit instantly. I tried to scream. I remember that part so clearly. I remember opening my mouth, trying to force sound out, trying to call for my parents, trying to do anything at all. Nothing came out, not even a gasp. It felt like my voice had been switched off completely. My chest tightened, my body locked up. I couldn't move my arms, I couldn't twist away, I couldn't even thrash. I was frozen in a way that didn't feel like sleep paralysis because I could feel everything happening to me in terrifying detail. My head was being pulled higher and higher. At some point, my face was nearly halfway out the window. I could feel the cool night air directly on my scalp and neck. I could feel the tension in my hair where it was being held. I remember thinking, very clearly, that if it pulled any harder, I would be out of the bed entirely, that I would be gone. I don't know how long it lasted. Time didn't make sense in that moment. It could have been seconds. It could have been longer. It felt endless. My heart was pounding so hard that I was sure it would give me away somehow, even though I didn't know to whom. I was certain, absolutely certain, that something was there. Not a dream, not my imagination. Something with intention, something that wanted me to go with it. And then suddenly, it let go. There was no transition, no easing of grip. One moment my hair was being pulled, and the next, there was nothing. The release was so abrupt that my head slid back inside the room and dropped onto the pillow. I sucked in air like I'd been underwater, gasping and choking as my lungs finally worked again. I didn't hesitate. I shot upright in bed and slammed the window shut as hard as I could. The sound of the glass hitting the frame was loud in the quiet house, but I didn't care. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely latch it, but I managed to force it closed. That's when I heard the voice again. "See you soon." It wasn't whispered this time. It was calm, certain, almost casual. Every hair on my body stood up. I scrambled backward on my bed, pressing myself against the wall as far away from the window as I could get. I stared at it, waiting for something else to happen, waiting for the glass to rattle or break, or for the voice to come back. Nothing did. The house went silent again. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think I slept properly for weeks afterward. Every sound made me flinch. Every shift of air felt threatening. I stopped opening my window at night completely. Even during the hottest days, I kept it locked and covered. I started sleeping with the blanket pulled up around my head, even though it made it harder to breathe, because somehow it felt safer than leaving myself exposed. I never told anyone, not my parents, not my friends. No one. I knew, even at 10 years old, that they wouldn't believe me. I knew exactly what they would say, that I had been dreaming, that it was a nightmare, that I imagined it because we had just moved and I was stressed, that it was sleep paralysis or a half-dream. I had already heard those explanations for other things, and I knew this would be no different. But I also knew what I experienced. I knew what it felt like to have my hair pulled hard enough to lift my head. I knew the terror of being unable to scream. I knew the sensation of the night air as my head was dragged toward the window, and I knew the voice, the way it sounded, the certainty in it. That certainty is what stuck with me the most. "See you soon" wasn't a threat shouted in anger. It wasn't mocking, it wasn't frantic, it sounded like a promise, like something said with patience, like it wasn't finished yet. As I got older, I tried to rationalize it. I read about sleep paralysis, I read about hypnagogic hallucinations. I read about how the brain can create incredibly vivid sensations when it's half asleep. I tried to convince myself that my memory had exaggerated the physical aspects over time, that fear had filled in gaps that weren't really there, but no explanation ever fully sat right. Sleep paralysis doesn't usually involve being physically pulled. It doesn't usually involve force that feels external and directional. And it doesn't usually leave you with the certainty that something was acting with intent. What bothers me even more is that this wasn't the only story like this I've heard. Other people, completely unrelated, have described almost identical words being whispered. The same phrase, "Come with me," sometimes from windows, sometimes from doorways, sometimes from beside their beds. That similarity is something I wish I didn't know about, because it makes it harder to dismiss as a random creation of my own mind. I don't know what happened that night. I don't claim to know what it was. All I know is that it changed how I see sleep and how I see safety. Before that night, my bed was just a bed. My room was just a room. The window was just a window. After that night, those things became vulnerable points. places where something could reach in, places where I wasn't as protected as I thought I was. Even now, as an adult, I'm careful about windows at night. I check locks more than once. I pay attention to where my bed is positioned in a room. I don't like sleeping with my head near an open window, even though I still love the feeling of night air. That instinct never fully went away. Sometimes late at night when everything is quiet and I'm lying awake, I think about that moment when it let go, about how easily it could have not let go, about how close I was to the window, to the outside, to whatever waited beyond it. And I think about the words, not the first ones, the last ones. See you soon. It's been a long time, and I still hope that wasn't true. This is something that has stayed with me because it all happened so close to home, either in my area or at a nearby college. None of these stories feel distant or abstract. They involve people my age, living the same kind of life, doing the same ordinary things. What makes them so disturbing isn't just how they died, but how sudden and fragile everything turned out to be. It really drives home the idea that life can end without warning, and that thought is both frightening and deeply sad. The first death was the one people talked about the most, mostly because no one ever got clear answers. It was a student, only 19 years old. In the United States, that's still basically a kid. Barely out of high school, just starting college, just beginning to figure out who they are and what they want to do with their life. From what everyone said, he had been drinking heavily one night. College drinking culture is so normalized that at first, people didn't think much of it. Parties happen, people drink too much. It's almost expected, even though it probably shouldn't be. At some point that night, he ended up at one of the taller buildings on campus. No one knows exactly what was going through his head. Some people said it was an accident, others said it might have been intentional. There were rumors that he was dared, or that he lost his balance, or that he was just too intoxicated to understand the danger. What everyone agreed on was that he fell or jumped from the building and died. That kind of death leaves behind nothing but questions. There was no note, no clear explanation, just a young life gone in an instant. People whispered about it in hallways and dorm rooms. Some treated it like a cautionary tale about drinking. Others tried not to think about it at all. But it was impossible to ignore how final it was. One bad night, one decision, or one mistake, and that was it. The second death hit people differently, because it felt even more unfair in a way that's hard to describe. This student was also 19, same age, same stage of life. He wasn't partying or doing anything reckless. He was sick. Just sick in the most normal, ordinary way. A cold. Something people deal with all the time without thinking twice. He came back to his dorm room feeling awful, probably exhausted, probably just wanting to sleep it off and feel better in the morning. He took some cough medicine, the kind you can buy over the counter without a prescription. Something millions of people take every year without any issues. What most people didn't know was that he had a heart condition. That combination, his illness, the medication, and his underlying condition, ended his life. Quietly, alone, in a dorm room where he was supposed to be safe. There was no violence, no chaos, no warning signs that anyone noticed in time. One moment he was a student dealing with a cold. The next, he was gone. That story shook people because it could have been anyone. There was nothing extreme about it. No risky behavior to point to. No obvious lesson to learn. It was just a reminder that bodies can fail, even young ones, and sometimes there's nothing you can do about it. It made people uneasy in a different way. You can avoid drinking too much. You can avoid dangerous situations. But you can't always avoid your own biology. The third incident was the most horrifying and the one that still feels almost unreal to think about. This student was also young. He had multiple disorders, and because of that, he stood out. Instead of being supported or understood, he was picked on by other students. Whether it was bullying, teasing, or just constant pressure and cruelty, it wore him down. People often underestimate how damaging that kind of treatment can be, especially when someone is already struggling. Something inside him snapped. It didn't happen quietly. It didn't happen in private. It happened in class, in a place where students expect to be safe. He brought a knife and attacked. 12 students were killed. 3 others were injured. The numbers alone are hard to process. 12 lives ended in a place meant for learning, discussion, and growth. What makes it even more disturbing is that it didn't go on indefinitely. The teacher intervened. The teacher physically held him down. That detail sticks with people because it shows how close the situation was to becoming even worse. One person stepping in stopped further loss of life, but it didn't undo what had already happened. Afterward, there was shock, grief, anger, and confusion. People argued about responsibility, about bullying, about mental health, about warning signs that may or may not have been missed. But none of those discussions brought back the students who were killed. None of them erased the trauma for the survivors, the injured, the families, or the people who witnessed it. What connects all of these stories isn't just death. It's how unpredictable it all is. One person dies because of alcohol and a building. Another dies because of a cold and medication. Another dies because someone else's pain turned into violence. There's no single cause, no single mistake, just a series of moments where life ended far earlier than it should have. When you're young, especially in college, there's this unspoken belief that death is far away, that it belongs to old age or extreme situations or far-off places. You worry about grades, relationships, money, the future. You don't usually worry about not surviving the year. Stories like these shatter that illusion. They force you to confront the fact that nothing is guaranteed, that being young doesn't make you invincible, that safety can disappear in ways you never expect. And that's terrifying. It's also incredibly sad. Each of those students had a life beyond the way they died. They had families who loved them, friends who expected to see them again, plans they never got to finish, futures that ended before they really began. When people talk about these cases, they often focus on the circumstances of death. But what gets lost is everything that came before and everything that never got a chance to happen. The first student will always be remembered for a fall, not for who he was. The second will be remembered for a medical tragedy, not for his personality or dreams. The third incident will always be defined by violence, even though it involved layers of suffering that went ignored until it was too late. It really does show that anyone can die at any moment. That realization can be overwhelming. It can make the world feel unsafe and unpredictable. But it can also make you think differently about how you treat people, how seriously you take mental health, and how fragile life actually is. None of these deaths were distant tragedies on the news. They happened nearby to people the same age, in places that felt familiar. That's what makes them so hard to forget. It's scary, yes, but more than that, it's heartbreaking. Because behind every one of these stories is the same truth. These were young people who should still be alive. And the fact that they aren't is a reminder that life doesn't always give warnings, and it doesn't always make sense. The Fernald Feed Materials Production Center is one of those places that most people have never heard of, yet its impact quietly shaped an entire era. It sat in rural Ohio, unassuming from the outside, surrounded by farmland and small communities that trusted what they were told. To the public, it was just another government facility, vaguely important, vaguely technical, and definitely not something you asked too many questions about. For decades, people lived their lives right next to it, raised families, drank the water, breathed the air, and assumed that if something dangerous was happening, someone somewhere would step in. That assumption turned out to be very wrong. Fernald was part of the early nuclear weapons program. Its job was the initial processing and enrichment of uranium used in atomic weapons. This was not clean work. It involved crushing, heating, converting, and handling massive amounts of radioactive material. In theory, all of this was controlled. In reality, it was messy, rushed, and deeply unsafe, especially in the early years, when secrecy mattered far more than environmental or human health. For decades, uranium dust was released into the environment, sometimes intentionally, sometimes through negligence, sometimes because the systems in place simply could not contain what they were being asked to handle. People living nearby were never fully informed. Workers were often told they were safe. Complaints were dismissed. Abnormal illnesses were chalked up to coincidence. Cancer clusters were ignored or quietly minimized. By the early 1980s, some people inside the system knew exactly how bad it was. One of them was Dave Box. Dave Box worked at Fernald and had access to information that most people never saw. He wasn't an activist in the public sense. He wasn't loud or dramatic. He was an insider who understood how the facility operated and how much was being hidden. Over time, he became increasingly alarmed by what he was seeing. Records, measurements, internal knowledge that directly contradicted what the Department of Energy was telling the public. Specifically, he had evidence that uranium dust was being released into the surrounding environment at dangerous levels. This wasn't just a minor safety issue. Uranium dust is inhalable. It settles into soil. It contaminates water. Once it's out there, it doesn't just disappear. It stays, it accumulates, and it slowly poisons communities that have no idea they're being exposed. Dave was preparing to go public. He was not supposed to do that. In 1984, Dave Box disappeared. Days later, his body was found inside one of the facility's processing areas, burned to death in what was described as a hot zone. According to official explanations, he had somehow wandered into a restricted area and died as a result of an accident. But that explanation never made sense. By all accounts, Dave should never have been able to access that specific area, not without authorization, not without alarms triggering, not without multiple layers of security and safety procedures being bypassed. This was not a place someone could simply stumble into, especially not a place that was actively operating at dangerous temperatures and radiation levels. The circumstances of his death raised immediate red flags. An investigation followed, but like many investigations involving classified or semi-classified government facilities, it was limited in scope and heavy on conclusions that closed doors rather than opened them. Officially, his death was treated as an accident. Unofficially, it became something far darker. The timing was impossible to ignore. Dave Box was on the verge of exposing evidence that uranium contamination was far worse than the government admitted. He was preparing to go public, and then he died in one of the most inaccessible, dangerous parts of the facility in a way that conveniently silenced him forever. For many people, especially those who worked at Fernald or lived nearby, the message was clear: don't talk. Whether Dave's death was a deliberate act or the result of gross negligence combined with convenient circumstances is something that has never been fully resolved. What is clear is that his death stopped him from revealing what he knew, and it sent a chill through anyone else who might have considered doing the same. Not long after, the truth began leaking out anyway. Community members started asking harder questions. Independent testing showed contamination. Workers came forward with stories of unsafe conditions. Lawsuits followed. Public outrage grew. The carefully maintained wall of secrecy began to crack. In 1989, the Fernald Feed Materials Production Center was shut down. In 1990, cleanup officially began. What followed was one of the largest and most complex environmental cleanup efforts in U.S. history. Fernald was designated a Superfund site, meaning it was recognized as severely contaminated and requiring long-term federal intervention. Soil had to be removed. Waste had to be contained. Structures had to be dismantled carefully, piece by piece, to avoid spreading further contamination. The cleanup took years. It wasn't just about tearing down buildings. It was about undoing decades of damage. Uranium had seeped into the ground. It had migrated into groundwater. It had spread beyond the immediate boundaries of the facility. Cleaning it up meant dealing with invisible contamination that couldn't simply be swept away. Some of the people who worked on that cleanup are still there. That detail alone says a lot. The site is still staffed by the Department of Energy, not because it's active in the way it once was, but because it has to be monitored, managed, watched. Radiation doesn't follow political timelines. It doesn't care that a facility is closed. The land itself remains dangerous in ways that require constant oversight. The word around the area is that they plan to manage the site for at least 100 years, if possible. That isn't exaggeration, that's realism. Some contamination can be reduced, some can be isolated, but some of it simply has to be contained and monitored over generations. Barriers degrade, soil shifts, water moves. Every change in the environment can potentially disturb what was buried or sealed away. Fernald today looks very different from what it once was. On the surface, it appears calmer, cleaner, controlled. But beneath that surface is a legacy that can't be erased. People who live nearby still deal with health consequences: cancer, autoimmune diseases, unexplained illnesses, conditions that doctors can't always trace to a single cause, but that show up in patterns that are hard to dismiss. Families who lost loved ones long before the truth came out carry a particular kind of anger. Not just grief, but the knowledge that it might have been preventable if honesty had come sooner. And then there's Dave Box. His name doesn't appear in textbooks. His story isn't widely taught. But among people who know Fernald's history, he is impossible to forget. He represents the cost of secrecy, the risk taken by someone who tried to do the right thing in a system that punished transparency. What makes his death especially haunting is not just the manner of it, but the context. A man with evidence of environmental contamination dies in a place he shouldn't have been able to reach, in a way that prevents him from ever speaking, an investigation that closes without satisfying answers, a facility that is later proven to have been lying about the extent of its contamination. Even if you assume the most charitable interpretation, that it was a tragic accident layered on top of institutional negligence, the result is the same. The truth was delayed, and people suffered because of that delay. Fernald is often discussed now as a cautionary tale, a reminder of what happens when national security is used as a shield against accountability, when communities are treated as expendable, when workers are expected to trust systems that don't value their lives. The site is quieter now, controlled, managed, but it will never truly be gone. That's the thing about places like Fernald. You can shut them down, you can clean them up, you can put fences around them and signs warning people to stay out, but you can't undo what was already released into the world. You can't take radiation back once it's out there. You can't give people their health back. You can't give families the years they lost. And you can't bring back someone like Dave Box. His story lingers because it sits at the intersection of fear, power, and truth. because it forces uncomfortable questions, because it reminds us that sometimes the most dangerous places aren't battlefields or disaster zones, but quiet facilities hidden behind bureaucratic language and reassurances. Fernald will likely remain under watch long after most of us are gone. 100 years isn't a metaphor. It's an estimate, an acknowledgement that what happened there was so serious, so lasting, that it outlives the people who caused it and the people who tried to expose it. The land itself carries the memory now, and for those who know the story, every mention of Fernald carries with it the same uneasy thought. If one person hadn't tried to speak up, how much longer would it have stayed hidden? This story is about my dog, Logan, but it is also about something much darker than the loss of a pet. Logan was a mix of a black Labrador, a boxer, and a pointer. He was 7 years old, in the prime of his life, or so we thought. He was truly a great dog, the kind of animal that felt more like a human soul trapped in a canine body. He was sweet, well-behaved, and incredibly intuitive. He had this presence about him that drew people in. We actually had neighbors and friends who would come over to our house specifically just to see him. They wouldn't even care if we were busy. They just wanted to sit with Logan for a while because he was such a kind, gentle soul. He was the heart of our home, a constant source of comfort and unconditional love. Then the nightmare began. It happened suddenly, like a storm cloud appearing out of a clear blue sky. One day he was fine, running and playing, and the next he fell extremely ill. It was confusing and terrifying because there had been no warning signs. He just collapsed. We rushed him to the vet, frantic and scared. After running a series of tests, the diagnosis came back, and it was worse than anything we could have imagined. We found out that his heart was slowly bursting. There was a cancer that had been growing silently in his bloodstream for months. We had absolutely no clue. He had hidden his pain so well, protecting us from the truth until his body simply couldn't fight anymore. The vet explained that he was suffering immense pain and that there was nothing they could do to save him. The cancer was too aggressive and his heart was too damaged. We knew we had to make the hardest decision a pet owner ever has to make. We had to end his suffering. We couldn't let our beautiful, gentle boy live in agony just because we weren't ready to let him go. We scheduled the euthanasia. Many people know this to be a heartbreaking tragedy, a sad part of life that we all eventually face. But what people often forget is that death can also be incredibly scary. It is a visceral, physical event, and when you are not prepared for the reality of it, it can be traumatizing. As we sat beside this angel on earth, knowing he was soon to return home, we attempted to prepare ourselves for what would be the hardest thing we had ever had to watch. The atmosphere in the veterinary clinic was heavy and suffocating. The smell of antiseptic, the cold fluorescent lights, and the hushed whispers of the staff all added to the dread pooling in our stomachs. We were gathered in a small, sterile room, surrounding Logan, who lay on a metal table looking so tired and weak. It broke my heart to see him like that, stripped of his strength. When my parents finally decided it was time to proceed, a conflict arose that turned this sad situation into a psychological horror show. My parents, specifically my father and stepmother, are not the best people. They have a very rigid, controlling way of parenting that borders on cruel. They tried to convince all of us to stay in the room and watch the life leave Logan's eyes. They didn't offer it as a choice. They presented it as a duty. My youngest sister was only 7 years old. My stepsister was 13. My oldest sister was also there. All of them were terrified, tears streaming down their faces, dreading what was about to happen. My second oldest sister managed to slip away. She couldn't handle it, and she made a break for the door. She didn't get away cleanly, though. Before she could leave, she was lectured by my parents. They scolded her, telling her that death was a part of life and that she should just suck it up and deal with it. It was harsh and unfeeling, lacking any empathy for her grief, but she managed to leave the room. Luckily for me, I had a built-in excuse. I had to watch the baby, so I stood just outside the door in the hallway. I wasn't in the room, but I was close enough to hear every sound, every sob, and every terrifying moment. As for my other 3 sisters, the 7-year-old, the 13-year-old, and the oldest, my stepmother ordered them to stay. It wasn't a request. She told them that if they tried to leave, they would be scolded for being disrespectful to the dog and to the family. She manipulated them, making them feel guilty, telling them they would be bad people if they abandoned Logan in his final moments. So, they stayed. They were trapped in that small room, forced to witness something no child should have to see if they aren't ready. The following details come from their description of what happened inside that room, and from what I saw through the crack in the door. The vet arrived with the injections. The room went silent save for the sniffling of my sisters. When they first started to put in the euthanasia solution, things seemed to be going smoothly, or at least as smoothly as you can imagine killing a beloved family member could go. Logan lay there, breathing shallowly. We were all holding our breath, waiting for him to simply drift off into a peaceful sleep. That is what you see in movies. The dog closes his eyes, sighs, and is gone. But real life is not a movie. Real death is messy and unpredictable. As the last bit of the dose exited the IV and entered Logan's bloodstream, the chemical reaction hit him. Suddenly, Logan did something I had never seen or heard him do in his entire 7 years of life. He let out a loud, haunting howl. It wasn't a bark, it wasn't a whine. It was a sound of pure, primal release. It sounded like his soul was being ripped out of his body. It was a long, mournful sound that echoed off the sterile walls and chilled us all to the bone. It was so loud and so full of sorrow that it triggered a chain reaction throughout the entire building. Every single dog in the vet clinic started howling too. From the kennels in the back to the waiting room, a chorus of howling dogs erupted. It was as if they all knew what was happening. It felt supernatural, like a choir of spirits guiding him out, or perhaps mourning his departure. The sound was deafening and terrifying. It broke the tension in the worst way possible. This was too much for my oldest sister. Despite the orders to stay, she couldn't take it anymore. She burst out of the room, sobbing uncontrollably. I would have done the same. The sound was haunting. My younger sisters, however, were paralyzed by fear and obedience. They stayed. I could hear them sobbing and calling Logan's name over and over again, begging him to be okay, begging him not to go. Their little voices were filled with such desperation. Through the crack in the door, I could see them huddled together, trembling. The vet checked Logan's vitals. The room fell silent again, the howling outside dying down. The vet looked up at my parents and whispered the words we were dreading. She said, "He is gone." We all let out a breath we didn't know we were holding. We thought it was over. We thought he was at peace. But he wasn't. Right as the vet said those words, Logan jerked his head up. It wasn't a small movement. He lifted his head off the table with sudden violent energy. He took a massive, gasping inhale. It sounded like he was drowning and trying to suck in all the air in the room. While he was doing this, his jaw was working. He seemed to be chewing on something. I think he was biting his own tongue in a spasm. I saw this clearly through the crack of the door. This was absolutely terrifying. It was so unexpected. The vet had just declared him dead, and now he was moving. For a split second, I thought he was going to stay awake. I thought the medicine hadn't worked. I thought he wasn't ready to go, or that he was too scared to leave us and was fighting the death. My mind raced with horror, but of course this was just wishful thinking and biological reaction. It was the body's last desperate attempt to survive. After that massive inhale, he let out a big exhale. It was a long, shuddering breath that took the last of his air with it. His body went limp, and he flopped back down onto the table with a heavy thud. But the horror wasn't over. As he hit the table, his body started to twitch and shake. It was violent, involuntary tremors running through his muscles. Then his bladder released. He urinated right there on the table. This was all a lot to take in. It would be traumatic for an adult, but for my sisters, who were only 7 and 13, it was a nightmare. They were watching their beloved dog, their best friend, be ripped of his dignity in front of most of our family. The smell of urine mixed with the antiseptic, the sound of his body hitting the table, the image of him gasping for air. It was a sensory assault of death. I couldn't stand outside anymore. I walked into the room at this point, needing to be with my sisters. I was not prepared for the sight I was going to see. My 2 younger sisters were on the floor in the fetal position. They were rocking back and forth, just hyperventilating and wailing. It wasn't just crying, it was the sound of pure trauma. They looked broken. And then I looked at Logan. My dog's lifeless body lay on the table. His abdomen was totally still. There was urine on his beautiful black fur. He was completely still now, the twitching having stopped. But worst of all were his eyes. They were wide open. They were already starting to cloud over, turning a milky gray color. They were staring at nothing. There were no more blinks. There was no more curiously observing the world he loved so much. There was no spark of recognition. It was just an empty body, a shell that would soon decay. He would never run in his favorite meadow again. He would never greet us at the door again. Instead of a peaceful goodbye, we were left with this image. We were left knowing that 6 of his loved ones were traumatized by his passing. Instead of remembering his wagging tail or his warm cuddles, we were left knowing that this horrific scene would be our last and strongest memory of him. The image of him gasping and twitching was burned into our brains. Even my parents, the ones who had forced this situation, realized they had made a mistake. They said later that they wish they hadn't seen that. My father, who tries to be so tough, could barely be inside the vet clinic during the actual procedure. He was pale and shaking. My stepmother, the one who demanded everyone stay, completely broke down. She stayed in that room for 3 hours after Logan was gone. She just sat on the floor next to his body, sobbing, unable to leave him. What was truly scary about this all was not the death itself. Death is natural. Bodies shut down. It is ugly, but it is part of nature. No, the scary part was the human element. It was terrifying to realize how my parents put their children through things that they couldn't even handle themselves. They forced a 7-year-old to watch a violent, messy death under the guise of teaching a lesson, while they themselves fell apart. This isn't just a story about a dog dying. It is a story about the horror of bad parenting. It is scary because this is only one example of how many parents in the world feel entitled to expose their children to things they should not have to see. They get away with it because they claim it is their right to teach their kids life lessons however they please. But there is a difference between teaching a child about death and forcing them to witness a traumatic medical event. That is the scariest story I know because it is 100% true for many, many children. We walked out of that clinic that day with one less family member and a lifetime of nightmares. We learned that the monsters aren't always under the bed. Sometimes they are the people who are supposed to protect you, making you watch while the things you love die screaming. I am probably getting some of the details wrong because this was something that happened to a friend's friend, but this story is scary enough to keep me awake at night. It is one of those stories that makes you question every interaction you have with strangers, especially in places that are supposed to be fun and safe, like bars or clubs. We all like to think we have good instincts, that we can spot a creep from a mile away, but sometimes evil comes wrapped in a very attractive package. This girl, let's call her Jessica, was just a normal young woman looking for a fun night out. She had been working hard all week, dealing with the stress of her job and the mundane routine of daily life, and she just wanted to let loose. She called up a few of her girlfriends, they got dressed up, and they headed to one of the popular bars downtown. It was a Friday night. The place was packed, the music was loud, and the energy was high. It was the perfect setting for a disaster that nobody saw coming. The night started off just like any other. Jessica and her friends were dancing, ordering drinks, and laughing. They were in their own little bubble, ignoring the guys who were trying too hard to get their attention. But then, Jessica noticed a guy standing near the edge of the bar. He wasn't like the others. He wasn't being loud or aggressive. He was just standing there, nursing a drink, looking incredibly calm amidst the chaos. He was handsome in a pale, brooding sort of way. He had dark hair, sharp features, and he was dressed better than most of the guys there. There was something magnetic about him. When their eyes met across the room, he didn't look away. He smiled, a slow, confident smile that made Jessica feel a flutter in her stomach. She nudged her friend and pointed him out. Her friend gave her the thumbs up, encouraging her to go talk to him. Jessica made her way over to the bar, and he immediately turned his attention to her. His name was Adam. He was charming, articulate, and seemed genuinely interested in what she had to say. They talked for a long time, shouting over the music at first, but then leaning in close to hear each other. He bought her a drink, and his manners were impeccable. He wasn't pushy. He asked her about her life, her job, her dreams. He seemed perfect. As the night went on and the alcohol kicked in, the chemistry between them grew intense. They moved from talking to dancing, and then from dancing to finding a quiet corner in a booth. They started making out. It was passionate and heavy. Jessica felt swept off her feet. He was a good kisser, but there was something slightly off about him that she couldn't quite place in the moment. His skin was incredibly cold, colder than the air-conditioned bar should have made him, and there was a faint, strange smell on him. It was masked by expensive cologne, but underneath the scent of sandalwood and musk, there was a chemical tang, something medicinal and stale. In the heat of the moment, Jessica ignored these red flags. She told herself his hands were cold because he was holding a cold drink. She told herself the smell was just the mixture of spilled alcohol and bar smells. They continued to kiss, her hands running through his hair, his hands on her waist. It felt like the start of a whirlwind romance. Eventually, the lights in the bar started to come on, signaling closing time. The crowd began to thin out. Adam leaned in close to her ear, his voice smooth and low. He asked her if she wanted to come back to his place. He said he had a nice apartment not too far away, and they could continue the night there. He promised her wine and good conversation. This was the moment that saved her life. As he asked the question, Jessica looked into his eyes. For a split second, the charm seemed to slip. She saw something flat and empty in his gaze. It was a look of hunger, but not sexual hunger. It was something predatory. Suddenly, the coldness of his skin didn't feel refreshing. It felt dead. The strange chemical smell seemed to spike in intensity, making her slightly nauseous. A wave of pure, irrational panic washed over her. It was her gut instinct screaming at her to run. It was that primal voice that we often ignore in favor of being polite. Jessica pulled back. She stammered an excuse, saying she had an early morning or that her friend needed a ride. She saw a flash of anger in Adam's eyes, a tightening of his jaw, but he quickly smoothed it over with a smile. He tried to convince her one more time, reaching out to touch her arm. His touch felt like ice. She pulled away, grabbed her purse, and practically ran to find her friends. They were confused, but followed her out, and they all went home separately. Jessica went home thinking she had just dodged a clingy guy, or maybe just ruined a potentially good night because of her anxiety. She went to sleep, hoping to forget about the weird end to the evening, but the nightmare was just beginning. A few days passed and Jessica started to feel unwell. It started with a sore throat, which she attributed to shouting over the music at the bar. Then came the fever. It wasn't a low-grade fever, it was a raging temperature that left her shivering and sweating in her bed. She felt weak, her muscles ached, and she had a terrible headache that wouldn't go away with painkillers. She called in sick to work, thinking she had caught a bad flu or maybe COVID. She stayed in bed, drinking fluids, waiting for it to pass. But it didn't pass. It got worse. By the fourth day, Jessica could barely stand up. She developed sores in her mouth, painful ulcers that made it difficult to swallow. Her breath began to smell terrible, a rotting metallic stench that disgusted even her. She noticed strange rashes appearing on her skin, particularly around her face and neck where Adam had kissed her. The skin looked angry, red, and in some spots it was turning a dark purplish color. She felt like her body was shutting down. Her roommate found her collapsed on the bathroom floor, burning up and delirious. Terrified, her roommate called an ambulance and Jessica was rushed to the emergency room. The hospital scene was chaotic. The doctors were baffled by her condition. They ran test after test. They tested for meningitis, for rare tropical diseases, for severe bacterial infections. Her white blood cell count was through the roof, indicating her body was fighting a massive infection. They put her on broad-spectrum antibiotics and isolated her, afraid that whatever she had might be contagious. Jessica was in and out of consciousness, terrified and in pain. She couldn't understand what was happening to her. She was a healthy young woman. How could she be dying? After what felt like an eternity, the lead infectious disease specialist came into her room. He was wearing full protective gear, which only added to Jessica's fear. He looked serious and confused. He held a clipboard with her lab results. He sat down next to her bed and asked her a question that she would never forget. He said, "Jessica, this may seem like a very weird and, frankly, a very disturbing question, but we need to know. Have you been in contact with any dead bodies recently?" Jessica stared at him through her feverish haze. She thought she had heard him wrong. "What?" she croaked, her throat raw. "No, why would you ask me that?" She was horrified. She worked in an office. She didn't work in a morgue or a funeral home. The doctor sighed and explained. The tests had come back identifying a specific type of bacteria in her system. It was a bacteria that is rarely found in living humans. It is a bacteria associated with the decomposition process of human flesh. It was essentially corpse poison. He told her that she had a severe infection usually only seen in people who handle remains without protection, or in worst-case scenarios, cannibals. Jessica's mind raced. She felt sick to her stomach. She hadn't touched a dead body. She hadn't been anywhere near a cemetery or a morgue. She tried to retrace her steps over the last week. Work, home, the gym, the grocery store. Nothing. Then the memory of Friday night hit her like a truck. She remembered the bar. She remembered Adam. She remembered his cold skin. She remembered the strange chemical smell that she now realized smelled like formaldehyde and decay. She remembered making out with him, his mouth on hers, exchanging saliva. The realization made her scream. She told the doctor about the guy at the bar. She told him about the kissing. She told him about the weird vibe and the smell. The doctor's face went pale. He immediately left the room and called the police. 2 detectives arrived at the hospital a few hours later. Jessica, still weak but lucid enough to talk, gave them a description of Adam. She told them the name of the bar and gave them the general area where he said he lived. She remembered he had mentioned a specific apartment complex near the downtown area. The police took the information seriously, especially given the medical evidence. The doctor confirmed that the only way she could have contracted this specific biohazard was through direct fluid exchange with someone who had been in intimate contact with a decomposing body. The police launched an investigation immediately. They went to the bar and pulled security footage. They identified the man Jessica had been with. His real name wasn't Adam, but they found his address. He lived in a quiet, older house just a few blocks from the bar, not an apartment like he had said. The police obtained a warrant based on the suspicion of him being a public health hazard and potentially involved in something criminal. They set up a raid on his house. When the police broke down the door of his house, the smell hit them first. It was the same smell Jessica had detected, but magnified 1,000 times. It was the stench of death, rot and heavy industrial cleaners trying to mask it. The house was dark, the windows covered with thick blankets. As they moved through the living room, they found it cluttered but relatively normal. However, when they moved to the bedroom, the horror was revealed. They found 3 bodies. They were the bodies of women who had recently died. He hadn't murdered them, he had stolen them. He worked at a funeral home as a night watchman and assistant, which gave him access to the bodies before they were buried or cremated. He had been smuggling them out, bringing them back to his house. The bodies were arranged in his bed. He had been preserving them with amateur embalming fluids, which explained the chemical smell. The police realized with disgust that he had been using these bodies for his own sick, twisted pleasure. He was a necrophile. He was sleeping with them, living with them, treating them like his girlfriends. The police found him in the basement, preparing a space for what they assumed would be a 4th victim. He was arrested on the spot. He didn't fight. He just seemed annoyed that his privacy was invaded. The investigation revealed that he would go out to bars to try and find living women to bring back, perhaps to join his collection, or perhaps just to simulate a normal life for a night. But because he spent so much time in intimate contact with the dead, his body was a carrier for all the bacteria and diseases associated with decomposition. He was a walking biohazard. When the police told Jessica what they had found, she broke down completely. The physical sickness was agonizing, but the psychological trauma was shattering. She realized that the bacteria ravaging her body had come from the mouths of dead women. She realized that when she was kissing him, she was effectively kissing the corpses he had been with. She realized how close she had come to going back to his house. If she had ignored her gut instinct, if she had gone with him, she might have walked into that bedroom. She might have seen the bodies, or worse, he might have decided that she would look better as part of the collection than as a guest. Jessica spent 2 weeks in the hospital. The antibiotics eventually worked, and the sores healed, though they left small scars around her mouth. She lost a lot of weight, and her hair thinned out from the stress and the fever. But the physical recovery was the easy part. The mental recovery has been much harder. She can't go to bars anymore. She can't stand the smell of cologne because she is terrified. It is masking the smell of death. She has trouble being intimate with anyone because the memory of that cold, dead taste in her mouth comes back. The man was charged with multiple counts of abuse of a corpse, theft, and reckless endangerment. He is currently in prison, and hopefully, he will stay there for a long time. But for Jessica, and for everyone who hears this story, the damage is done. It is a terrifying reminder that there are monsters living among us. They don't always look like monsters. Sometimes they look like a handsome guy at a bar offering you a drink and a smile. And sometimes the only thing standing between you and a house full of horrors is that tiny, quiet voice in your gut. telling you that something isn't right. It serves as a lesson to always trust your instincts. If a vibe feels off, it probably is. And if a guy's hands feel a little too cold or he smells a little too strange, run. Don't look back, just run. If you're still here, it means these stories didn't just pass through you, they stayed. Every story you heard tonight was real. Real people, real moments. And in every one of them, something went wrong, or almost did. If you want to keep exploring the stories that don't let go so easily, subscribe to Shadow Archives, because there are more stories waiting, and not all of them end before it's too late.